The Japanese military bases, on the symbols of imperial ambition and strength, now stand as quiet witnesses to a world that no longer needs them. With Japan's surrender in 1945, these vast strongholds, built over years of war, faced an uncertain future. Some decayed in tropical humidity, others were repurposed, and many were left to rot, their concrete walls slowly sinking into the earth. Yet, the remnants of these bases, now forgotten or transformed, remain scattered across the Pacific, haunting the landscape as physical markers of a past Japan desperately sought to leave behind. The question of what to do with these sites became more than a logistical challenge, it became a symbol of Japan's painful post-war transformation. The Japanese military bases that once spanned the Pacific and Southeast Asia were vast, fortified, and heavily staffed. Their construction had taken years, their expansion had been swift and relentless, fueled by ambition and war. But with the Japanese surrender in 1945, these formidable sites faced an immediate and profound question: what becomes of these now-defunct strongholds? The answer, like the remnants of the empire they represented, would be scattered, repurposed, or simply left to rot in the humidity of a post-war world that no longer needed them. In the immediate aftermath of Japan's defeat, the Japanese military's sprawling infrastructure became a symbol not of power, but of excess. The war had left the nation economically drained, politically fractured, and physically decimated. Japan's infrastructure had been strained to breaking point during the war years, and now the once mighty military bases, spread across thousands of islands and territories, were part of the immense weight pulling the country back from the brink. One of the first decisions was simple: the military was dismantled. Under the terms of surrender, Japan's war-making machinery was to be completely disbanded, leaving behind the question of how to deal with its remaining military assets. This was not a small task. There were hundreds of bases across the Pacific, from the jungles of Burma to the beaches of the Philippines, from the coral atolls of the Pacific Islands to the mountains of Manchuria. Their size and scale were staggering. Some, like the infamous naval base at Truk Lagoon, were heavily fortified with gun emplacements, airstrips, barracks, and dockyards. Others were scattered outposts in the jungle, holding little more than a few soldiers and a radio. What would happen to these locations? What did one do with thousands of soldiers' lives and resources now rendered useless, yet still physically present in the form of concrete bunkers, artillery, and military infrastructure? The scale of the challenge was monumental. Japanese military bases were not just relics of war, they were a symbol of an empire now reduced to ashes, and the logistical nightmare of cleaning them up would test both the victor and the vanquished. The U.S. occupation of Japan began almost immediately, with General Douglas MacArthur leading the way. His mission was clear: demilitarize Japan, establish a new political order, and prevent any future military resurgence. But the destruction of Japan's military bases posed its own set of unique challenges. These bases weren't just to be abandoned, they needed to be neutralized, cleared, and often repurposed for civilian use. The Allies, particularly the Americans, now had to figure out how to dismantle and dispose of this vast network of infrastructure that had once fueled the Japanese war effort. In some areas, the immediate decision was to simply leave the bases to decay. The remote islands, once vital to the empire's strategic dominance, became largely irrelevant. For example, on many of the Pacific Islands, the abandoned airstrips, concrete fortifications, and bunkers were slowly reclaimed by nature. In the humidity of the tropics, concrete crumbled, metal rusted, and the once sterile military sites became overgrown with vines and moss. But while nature took over in some places, others presented more pressing concerns. The sheer volume of military equipment and the constant threat of unexploded ordnance made it a dangerous task to simply leave the bases to be forgotten. In areas like Manchuria, however, the consequences of the war were even more immediate. The Japanese military's presence there had been massive, involving thousands of soldiers and vast amounts of infrastructure. With the collapse of Japan's military might, the Soviet Union moved quickly into the region, seizing control of many of these bases. The Soviet forces, after their victory over the Japanese in 1945, found themselves inheriting bases that had been abandoned or left in disrepair, with equipment and supplies that were no longer of any use to the Japanese, or the Soviets, for that matter. While some of these bases were destroyed outright, many others were left in their original state, sitting dormant for years. The Soviet Union, which had its own war plans and military priorities, had little use for the bases themselves but still needed to deal with the remnants left behind. For years, these Soviet-controlled sites served as a reminder of both the power and futility of the Japanese war effort. They were largely left untouched, a post-war dead zone of military detritus. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, in the Philippines and other Pacific islands, the United States was faced with a different set of challenges. The remnants of Japanese bases, airstrips, naval facilities, and garrisons were valuable in a different sense. As the U.S. began rebuilding and reasserting control in the Pacific, many of the former Japanese strongholds were repurposed for American military needs. Some were transformed into military training bases, while others were converted into supply depots, housing for U.S. personnel, or even research facilities. But not all of the Japanese bases were easily adapted. Some were simply abandoned, left to the elements, their usefulness forgotten. One such example was the base at Wake Island, which had been a major Japanese stronghold during the war. After Japan's surrender, the island was largely ignored, with the infrastructure left to decay. Even today, remnants of the old Japanese base can still be seen on Wake Island, though much of it is covered in sand and overgrowth, a ghostly reminder of the war's lasting impact. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining and dismantling these bases added to the burden on Japan's already struggling post-war economy. The American occupation forces, as part of their demilitarization program, began the long and expensive task of clearing abandoned military sites. This was no easy feat. In addition to the physical destruction of war material, there was also the environmental cost. Explosives and chemicals used during the war left traces on the land, adding yet another layer to the already complex task of rebuilding Japan. The question of what to do with Japan's military bases was not just a matter of physical cleanup. It was a symbol of the country's shifting place in the world. The once proud imperial power now faced the task of reconciliation, not just with the Allies, but with itself. The idea of rebuilding Japan, of turning military sites into civilian zones, became a powerful symbol of the nation's post-war transformation. Yet, the physical remnants of war, these vast, crumbling bases, were inescapable reminders of the cost of that transformation. At the same time, the larger question of Japanese war reparations loomed large. The Allies, particularly the United States, had their own economic concerns, and the Japanese military's assets, including those left in the form of military bases, remained part of the equation. Japan's post-war economy would depend not only on rebuilding its civilian infrastructure but also on dealing with the financial obligations stemming from the war. This included paying for the destruction caused by its military presence across Asia and the Pacific. In the early post-war years, Japan's focus was on survival. The bases and their destruction were simply one more piece of a much larger puzzle. The rapid pace of change during this period meant that many of these once proud facilities were repurposed or forgotten almost overnight. Yet the physical remnants of these bases remain to this day. They are a silent testament to the scale of Japan's wartime efforts and the massive task of dealing with their aftermath. The immediate actions taken by the occupying forces, the U.S., the Soviet Union, and other allies, set the stage for a process of gradual, sometimes haphazard, cleanup. Some bases were quickly dismantled, others left to slowly fade away, and some became a new home for a different kind of military occupation. The story of these bases in the years following Japan's defeat is one of both loss and adaptation. Some were obliterated, erased from history as symbols of war, others were repurposed, converted into civilian infrastructure, and even monuments to the nation's new path. But in each case, the bases, like the empire they represented, were fundamentally changed. What began as the backbone of military power became, in many cases, a weight to be managed, disposed of, or simply left behind. The dismantling, abandonment, and repurposing of Japan's military bases continued into the 1950s and 1960s, with the process varying widely depending on location, strategic importance, and the needs of the occupying forces. Some sites were transformed into symbols of peace and reconstruction, while others remained abandoned, slowly sinking into the earth as the remnants of a brutal past. The question of what to do with the old military infrastructure was not only a matter of practical cleanup, it was deeply entwined with Japan's identity and its relationship with the rest of the world. In many of the Pacific Islands, forces quickly moved to either dismantle or repurpose former Japanese bases. In some cases, such as at the strategic island of Iwo Jima, the Americans simply took over the facilities, maintaining the airstrips and storage bunkers for their own use. The U.S. military's long-term presence in the Pacific meant that many former Japanese facilities were integrated into American military operations. These bases were updated and adapted to fit new needs, their Japanese origins fading into the background as they became part of the new Cold War strategy. However, not all bases were fortunate enough to see this repurposing. On many smaller islands in the Pacific, particularly those with little strategic value or difficult terrain, the old military infrastructure was simply abandoned. The battle for control over these far-flung territories had long since been won, and there was no need to maintain the airstrips or bunkers. Over time, these sites fell into ruin, eroded by the tropical weather. On islands like Saipan and Tinian, the once proud concrete bunkers, now cracked and discolored, were left as desolate reminders of a time when these islands had been crucial to Japan's military plans. One of the more tragic outcomes of these abandoned bases was the continued presence of unexploded ordnance. Many of the Pacific Islands, such as Okinawa and Guam, remained littered with unexploded bombs and artillery shells, posing a significant risk to civilians and military personnel long after the war had ended. On some islands, these remnants were cleared and disposed of, but in others, they were left to slowly decay, with little effort put into their removal. Back in Japan, the challenge of repurposing the land occupied by the military bases was compounded by the pressing need for rebuilding the nation's civilian infrastructure. The process of dismantling the war machine was slow and methodical. The majority of Japan's military installations on the mainland had been destroyed or repurposed by the time the occupation ended in 1952. Yet, the legacy of these bases could still be seen in the sprawling industrial complexes, the remnants of airstrips now serving as civilian airports, and the vast tracts of land that were converted into farmland or new urban developments. The most famous example of repurposing came with the transformation of the Imperial Army's former military complex in the city of Tokyo. Once a center of military power, the area was turned into the Tokyo National Gymnasium, which hosted the 1964 Summer Olympics. Similarly, other military facilities in urban areas became the foundations for the emerging post-war economy, with some of the land being sold or leased for industrial development. Japan's recovery from the war relied heavily on these repurposed sites, which helped fuel the rapid economic growth of the 1950s and 1960s. The financial costs of dealing with the aftermath of Japan's military presence in the Pacific remained high. By the time Japan was formally declared a pacifist nation, it had already committed significant resources to clearing the remnants of its wartime infrastructure. Much of the cost of cleanup and repurposing was absorbed by the U.S. military and the Japanese government, which struggled to manage the vast amounts of military equipment, munitions, and infrastructure that still littered the region. As the years went by, the global context shifted. The Cold War intensified, and the United States found itself increasingly reliant on military installations in the Pacific. Former Japanese bases that had been abandoned or repurposed earlier in the post-war years became vital once more, this time to serve as outposts for American defense strategies. Sites in places like Okinawa, where the U.S. had established long-term military installations, became central to U.S. military operations throughout the region, effectively linking the remnants of Japan's imperial military infrastructure to the Cold War order. However, not all of Japan's military legacies were so easily integrated into the new global structure. As the 20th century wore on, many of the bases left behind after the war became haunting symbols of an era that Japan was eager to move beyond. The scars of war, those concrete bunkers, rusting artillery pieces, and broken airstrips, remained present in the collective consciousness of a country that had experienced profound shame and loss. While some bases were reborn into new forms, others were left to crumble, either forgotten by history or ignored by those who had no stake in their past. There was a psychological toll too. For the Japanese people, the dismantling and abandonment of military bases was not merely about reclaiming land, it was about reconciling with their wartime legacy. Many of the sites had once been integral to Japan's imperial ambitions, and to witness them being repurposed, dismantled, or simply erased from memory was to confront the reality that the nation's past could never be fully shed. In some cases, particularly in Okinawa, the remnants of the Japanese military base were not just abandoned but left as a symbol of U.S. dominance in the region. The American military presence, including the continuing use of former Japanese bases, became a point of tension between Japan and the United States, especially during the post-war years when anti-American sentiment in Okinawa and other regions began to rise. The fate of Japan's military bases after World War II was, in many ways, a metaphor for the country's larger post-war journey. Some sites were erased, repurposed, and forgotten. Others were left standing, their silent presence offering a stark reminder of the war's lingering legacy. The gradual decay of these bases, from once pristine military fortresses to abandoned ruins, mirrored Japan's attempt to rebuild, redefine itself, and move forward into a world that demanded not only economic recovery but moral and political renewal. But even in their destruction and abandonment, these military sites continue to haunt the Pacific landscape. They remain quietly in the background of the history of the region, a reminder of the cost of war and the enduring scars it leaves on the land and the people who once occupied it. These remnants, while no longer centers of power or strategic importance, still hold an undeniable significance. They are not merely the ruins of a war, they are the physical markers of a moment in history that shaped not just Japan, but the entire world.